Welcome to All the Things, the unscripted podcast where we talk to intriguing people from a variety of cultures, backgrounds, and career paths and deconstruct who they are and why they think the way that they do. We dig deep and ask unexpected questions to learn about all the things, from faith and current events to relationships and mental health. We want to satisfy your craving for knowledge, true connection, and real conversation. This is Lenya Heitzig and Lindsay Maestas.
All the
Hey everyone, welcome back to the All the Things podcast. This is Lindsay Maestas. Today, Lenya could not be with us, but I am so excited to introduce you to our guests today, Jena Gallo and Laura McEwen.
Thanks for having us.
So we're touching on a pretty heavy topic this morning. I just woke up. I haven't even had my first sip of coffee. I love doing morning interviews because I just feel like it's a good start to the day. Communicating and having like real honest conversations it's refreshing. Well, just to dive into it, we are going to be talking about sexual assault today and healing. And I'm just so thankful for you, Laura and Jena, because your heart for women to advocate for those who have been sexually assaulted and to help through the process of healing. Can you talk a little bit about what MEND does, your ministry, and how that came to pass?
Yeah. MEND is a ministry for anyone that has experienced any form of sexual trauma. When we first kind of started it, and Laura, jump in and correct me, we would say sexual assault, and then we realized there's just so many forms of sexual trauma that we kind of wanted to be careful of our language so people felt like, yes, this is a space for me, no matter what my story is. Yeah. So we put together an 8-week program that happens in the fall and spring semester where we address the residual effects of sexual trauma. So we just believe fully in the power of community and shared stories. And that is kind of the space that we just really wanted to create for women who were hurting and walking that road.
I mean, it's a lot to it, but that's a great summary. And yeah, the sexual trauma piece versus sexual assault, that's just a thing that we learned because people often don't feel like their story matters or it counts because it's not the same as someone else's that they've heard or they saw on TV or whatever it was. And so we want people to really look more at like how they're feeling, and they feel like something wrong happened, and it did. And so you're welcome here. And so regardless of exactly the details of that, we wanted to create a safe, confidential place. And so we've been doing that for about 1.5 years now.
That's amazing. First week of the class, we actually address a lot of lies culture and society tells women, because we really found that one of the biggest pieces for women to step into something like this is they just believed all the lies they were told. And whether that be that it was their fault or their story doesn't matter compared to somebody else who they might hear where it sounds more severe. So we really try to crush those lies from day one, just so people can really focus on that emotional side of the healing process.
Wow, that is so good. So I shared a little bit with Laura and Jena for our listeners before we hopped on that a part of my story, which I've never really talked about on All the Things, is rape. And I love specifically that you focus in on that because one of the parts of my story is that I was basically written off. I tried to tell people, which you hear a lot of women who don't tell people because they're afraid of what the response might be or not being believed. And that was my experience. And it was very much diminished for years and years because the guy was a well-known football player. It was written off and kind of diminished until I finally started talking about it years and years later. And the lies I believed throughout that time, because I believed I had caused it or I believed I had deserved it, which I know now is definitely not the case, but I lived a life of complete sexual promiscuity because I believed I was worthless. And I was like, well, if the people closest to me aren't going to address or deal with this, then I'm going to heal in the only way that I knew how when I was a 14-year-old girl, you know? So I'm so thankful for women like you who push the boundaries and who are willing to address the lies and to address the social constructs that have been created in such a damaging way around sexual assault. So Jena, I am just so thankful for your heart and your willingness to share today. Lenya and I always want to be sensitive to those types of topics. So at any point, if you don't feel comfortable, feel free. But I would love for you to share your story on sexual assault if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely. So back in 2018, so I'm currently on staff at a church in Raleigh, North Carolina, Hope Community Church. And I was working there at the time in the beginning of 2018. And I just felt really called to leave ministry. And I ended up in a corporate job around March of 2018. So it was a huge change and step for me. And I would say, I think timeline-wise, in June, I was on a dating app and I met a guy there and went out on a date. And it was actually June 18th of 2018. So it actually turned out, I knew this going into it, that he worked at the same company I did, but it's a really big company. And we never saw each other there. But June 18th, we went out on a date and I was raped and assaulted that evening. And actually the next day I came back to work, and it turns out we worked in the same building. So it was really just a roller coaster of a time for me. I don't think I knew at the time. Well, I knew what had happened. I knew it was rape and I knew I'd been assaulted, but I just don't think I could have wrapped my head around that actually happened to me. I think that's just kind of one of those things, until it does happen, you don't think it can happen to you.
Right.
So I remember even calling my best friend that night. She moved out of state and I was just sobbing on the phone, and I couldn't even say what it was, but she knew. And that really just started a really, really hard journey. I hid it for that whole summer from everybody in my life. And finally, through the persistence of a really close friend who's a coworker while I was on staff at Hope, I finally opened up and shared what had happened. And I actually returned on staff 3 months after I left. My job was still open. And I would say that was when it really started, just facing what had happened. At that point, I had not gone through an investigation. I was kind of like, you can see, I didn't think anybody would believe me. He worked really high up at this company, and I just wanted out. I didn't want anybody to know what had happened there. I just wanted to leave and kind of go on with my life without anybody kind of knowing what had happened that night.
Yeah. Wow. So as you process through after that happened, say the next morning, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I could not believe it. I was in so much physical pain, and I was also just emotionally, honestly, I don't think my brain caught up to what had happened. Visually, I can see stuff was wrong, and I was in just a lot of pain. And I actually, that day, my best friend who I called the night before, she had encouraged me to go meet up with a friend in the area who was actually my small group leader at the time. And I don't know why I went. I knew it was, I just knew she was a trusted person, and I didn't know her that well, but I just agreed to go. And I remember going in, I met her for breakfast and just sat there and cried and told her what had happened. And I didn't even fully say what it was, and she just knew. And I think that was when it really became real of admitting. I think when you have a lot of physical pain too, things just start sinking in, but I just couldn't believe it happened. I felt a ton of guilt that I put myself in the position that I was in the night before, of going to somebody's house that I didn't really know. Mm-hmm. Although like now I know it is not my fault, but then it was just the overwhelmingness right away of the shame and the guilt and just the reality as what was setting in at that time.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you, and this is almost just a personal relation question, but so after my assault, I went to the Rape Crisis Center the next morning. And at that time I was young. This was, oh my gosh, so many years ago. I was young. So I went in, and I'm not sure if they still do it the same now, but they basically, and I've shared this on, I have another podcast, the Living Easy podcast. It's, I think, episode 30, where I share my whole testimony and I share more in depth. But ultimately they did an evaluation of me. and they had a video camera as they did an evaluation. And I remember thinking at the time, oh my gosh, this is horrendous. Like, I don't want to see cuts and bruises and scrapes and all of that had happened. But now, as I look back, I am so thankful for that time. I'm going to get emotional. I'm so thankful for that time because it is the like one thing I could hold on to affirm that it was not my fault. It was not done by me, and it was real. And there's nobody who can excuse video evidence. Do you feel like, looking back, that maybe that physical pain that has helped with the gaslighting or the lies of the enemy, and just knowing this actually did happen to me?
Yeah, it definitely helped. Even just thinking back, like, you knew something wrong happened. That wasn't my fault. And I think the level of pain that I remember being in, and just the bruises and just the physical marks that you could actually see, that you knew that something bad had happened. And it, I think it made it that much more real. Yeah. But it also was hard too. The days after, I remember that it lasted a while, and it was just this constant reminder that was there as well. Of, you wake up every morning, it hurts to get out of bed, and then you have, you're just reminded why. And I didn't go for rape kit. I opted out of that. I think, there was just so much fear that built up after, of just not feeling believed, or just a stereotype of, I was a girl who was drinking, who went to a guy's house, and, therefore that, happens. But I did eventually report it months later. And kind of had a similar thing of just, they record everything there, and it's just a whole experience. And it kind of brings a lot of that back to the reality. And I think that too was another marking moment where it really just sunk in as to what, had happened.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So Laura, I want to hear from your side. So can you talk about, as an outsider's perspective, kind of walking through this with Jena and kind of creating Mend together? Can you talk about your experience walking through this assault and coming alongside as a friend to help with the healing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, so the role I have, I'm on staff at the same church that we worked at, and my role is in care ministry. So I'm very accustomed to people who are hurting coming in and sharing whatever life's hurts are. And then my goal is to always just listen, be a supportive person, and then hopefully help resource them to next steps. So when Jena came in to my office that morning, the trusted friend she had mentioned, they had said, hey, why don't you go talk to Laura? And I remember sitting on my couch, and Jena and I, while we worked together, we didn't work closely together. So it was more just like casual conversations in the hall while the food heated up in the microwave. It wasn't like a close relationship, but she was sharing something that was so incredibly vulnerable, and I could see such pain. And my heart just broke for her. And I, of course, wanted to give her professional resources of counseling to connect her with, but my heart just ached that she needed more than that. She needed someone who was able to walk alongside of her, who believed her, and who was just there to help navigate uncharted territory. And I really felt really ill-equipped, because while I think God's gifted me in a way that I, don't mind heavy things, and I, feel drawn to those things, I felt very ill-equipped because I hadn't walked closely with someone who'd gone through sexual trauma, and it wasn't my story. So it's not like I could have like, oh, well, this is like your next steps. This is what you should do. Like, I had none of that. And so, but I offered, and she was very quick to say that she wanted a support person like that. And so we just did it together. We wanted to go through either a book or a study, because we were just kind of like at a loss of like, I don't know what the resources are, so maybe we'll try a book. And so we went to Google and like typed in things, because there wasn't even a ton of resources that I knew about. And so we found a great book called Rid of My Disgrace. It's Lindsay and Justin Holcomb, right?
Holcomb.
Yeah. So we found that book, and we started reading it together, and the whole beginning of it is just about sexual trauma, the prevalence of it, all of that. And then it gets into like that residual, the things that people are feeling. So we were able to kind of learn a little bit more about sexual trauma to begin with. And then we started, as our relationship was growing and we were trusting more, then I could ask her the hard questions, and I could ask her, what is this? How do you feel when we talk about this topic of guilt and shame? And so, we journeyed through that book, and then she asked if I would go along when we had to figure out where the guy lived, because there's a lot of like things that you can block out. And she had deleted the texts, the address and everything. We drove around the city, and I mean, it was a crazy time, but it was just like to be invited in to love someone that way was such a gift. And it really solidified such a great friendship. And is one of my dearest friends now. But then, Mend came out of that too, because there was a desire on her part to not just waste this pain and to try to like help others through it. And the Lord was just bringing person after person in my office that fall. Like he's not subtle. I don't think sometimes it's just like, hey, red flag, big lights. This is a big problem. And a lot of people outside of Jena are hurting in this way. And what can you do about it?
Wow. That's powerful. I just want to say for both of you, what a blessing that is. One, Jena, to have someone walk alongside so faithfully and so unwavering in their belief for you. It's such a gift to have that. And Laura, for you I love that you said it's a gift for you to carry those heavy things and that they're not heavy for you, because I genuinely believe that God has appointed people like that to carry those burdens that we really can't carry alone. And as you were speaking, I thought of 2 Corinthians 1:2-4. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. And you both are living out in obedience that calling to use the comfort God has given to you, Jena and Laura, to love on other women who are facing the same struggles. And you did mention, Laura, the shame that Jena was feeling. How did you process through, or can you encourage maybe our listeners who may be struggling with those feelings of shame and guilt? And Jena, you can speak to this too. How did you process through and encourage Jena to work through that time of feeling dirty and gross and shameful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the only way I know to combat lies is with truth. And so when I think I was a safe enough person for her to express the real thoughts. And so until she believed those truths, I would just believe them for her. And I would try to remind her of those things. And when I could see her mind going down a wrong way of thinking of lies, and I just try to refocus her in on that. And I would want that done for me, because that's just what community is. It's like iron sharpens iron. And so when we're struggling and when we're not able to see things the way that we know is true, but we're just in such a haze, we just need someone else to speak to that. And so all the guilt and the shame, that was like she said earlier, it was because of all the lies she believed, whether they just be myths that are common in our culture, but they weren't true about her. And so it was really easy for me to say them. What was hard is I knew that they were our pastor always says the longest 12 inches is between our head and our heart. And like to be able to get that information down into our hearts and to believe that is just really a work, and to not rush that journey, because Jena did want to rush it and, just wants to get past it. You want to be done. You don't want the pain. Who wants to sit in that? That's like awful. But it's necessary, because you can't heal what you don't name, and you can't move forward in the healing process until you kind of uncover some of that deep rooted stuff.
I would agree with that too. I think what I learned is the power of community through that stuff. I am an Enneagram 2, and I hate asking for help. So that was probably the hardest thing, to allow Laura to walk this with me. But I think to combat those lies and the shame, you have to have somebody who, just like what Laura did, was speaking that truth when you couldn't believe it for yourself. But also, I think praying for that when you can't pray yourself, having somebody who is praying for you and cheering for you. I always joke with her, the one thing that has been so hard to meet so many women and men is the ones that share that they weren't believed or they weren't supported. Because that, I had a few people who were negative towards it, but not, I mean, I had more people who were for me that were against me. And I always joke with her that I think everybody needs a Laura and needs somebody who can walk so closely through that. And she was just a trusted person. So, you know, you think some crazy things in your mind when you walk through something like that you don't want to share with anybody because you think you're nuts. But she allowed for that space to really share those like really deep, really hard lies. And she was able to speak truth until I was willing to believe that. So
that's so good.
Well, and I think it's important to just share that Jena showed me a lot of grace, because like, if you're a person who, you know, a loved one has gone through this and you just feel like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do this. And I might not do it great all the time. Like, she's very affirming of me, but like, there are certainly times where maybe I pushed harder than I should have, or I wasn't realizing what was best for her. Because I just had this vision of what healing looked like. And so like, there were times where I messed up and she still invited me into that. And so I think as a friend or someone who, you know, wants to be that kind of person to someone who's hurting, I think you just have to know that there's not a perfect way that you're going to do it, and that you probably will mess up at times. But what I love about Jena and I's relationship is we know at the end of the day, our hearts are for one another, and we believe that we want the best for one another. And so we can get through those times when maybe we're missing a little bit or we're not on the same page. But overall, I would say by and large, this has been a really healthy, good relationship for the healing process.
Yeah. Man, you touched on so much. I fully agree with that. And I love that you stated that, because I think sometimes as people who are walking through pain with others, they retract a little bit because they feel like they can't be perfect at helping them heal. But Jesus has never called us to be perfect. He says that in our weakness, he is strong. And so when we rely upon him and yet still show up for people, knowing we're not going to be the perfect counselor, the perfect friend, the perfect person to help them walk through their pain, they don't need somebody who is perfect at it. Jena didn't need you to be perfect, Laura. She just needed you to show up. And I think that is huge. Like the girls who took me to the Rape Crisis Center, that is something that will stick with me for the rest of my life, because they showed up for me, you know, and they were willing to have those really hard conversations, not only with me, but with other people in my life who were diminishing what happened. At the time, I didn't know the Lord, but I needed to seek Jesus' face. I needed to know that he was the perfect redeemer, the perfect healer. There's nothing that nobody else can do to make that better. I just needed their presence. And so for anyone who has friends who's been through this, even if it's been years and you've never talked about it because it's uncomfortable and maybe you avoided it, I would just encourage, like, don't ever be afraid to ask how they're doing. You know, that's not something that just goes away and that you completely forget happened. And then one other point that you touched on is naming it. And I am such an advocate of this. And I would love to hear more of your perspective on this, because I believe so strongly that Satan loses his power when our sin or our trial is in the light, when we put it out there. I believe that when we speak out, and this is what I've experienced, especially with my podcast and sharing these things, is that there's so much freedom when you're willing to open up, just like you both are talking about this and having the ability to address something so hard. You feel like it's going to make it worse, that there's going to be more shame, that people are going to judge you. And those are the lies that Satan would want you to believe. But when it's actually in the light, the bondage is gone, because there is no bondage when you're in Christ Jesus. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So Jena, can you talk a little bit about maybe the freedom that you felt as you started talking about it? What was that process like for you as you confessed to Laura and as you walked through the shame? Did you feel as if kind of the chains were being loosened as you communicated more?
Yeah, definitely. What's a little crazy about my story is right before Laura and I met, the trusted friend I mentioned who was on staff, the agreement for me to come back on staff was actually right before I did, was to meet with Laura. And I said I would, in exchange that nobody else on staff or in my life knew about it. So gosh, Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, I probably walked a solid 8 months before anybody who I shared an office with or anything knew. And that those chains definitely were lifted as Laura and I discussed it more and talked through it. But there was still always that lingering hold. And I think it truly was because I was believing so many lies of the enemy that people would think less of me if my coworkers found out. They wouldn't see me the same way. And I was just holding so tight to I never wanted to share what had happened. But God has always a crazy way of revealing things. And as we started dreaming up Mend and we were planning, I knew that one day if Mend launched, that would mean my story would come out as well. I think it was Easter of 2019. We always share a redemption story in service, just someone's story and what that looked like walking in the relationship with God. And I was actually asked to share my story that Easter about what had happened, which was such a scary and crazy thing because I knew once that had happened, then everybody that I didn't want to hear my story would hear my story. And I think that really was a turning point in really seeing what it could feel like to allow God to use your story and also start breaking those chains. And it wasn't easy. I mean, I shared my story and I honestly, and Laura can speak to this after that, I felt like I kind of spiraled again a bit in the lies. I just felt even more shame, oddly enough, after sharing it. But that's not what people showed me. I mean, people rallied around that and supported it. And God opened the door for some really awesome conversations with people in my life that I didn't even know that it was part of their story. So yes, to anybody that has struggled to share it, I do truly believe at the end of the day, and I can say this now, that the more you talk about it and the more you shine a light on that, the less of a hold Satan has on that, and God will use it.
How did that time impact your view of Jesus and your relationship with him? Was it a negative experience or was there like such a heavy reliance on him?
That was a really hard season with my relationship with God. I will definitely say it was a really negative view. I struggled a ton. I mean, as soon as it had happened, I truly wanted no part in God. And I really started battling the questions of, is God good? Because the God that I believed in, the God I knew, why would he let something that horrible happen to me? And I really struggled with, if God truly was good and he is God, then why didn't he stop what had happened that night? And it was a long time. And to be truthfully honest, it is still a battle. It's nowhere near what it was back then, because God showed up in so many ways. And I think one of the biggest turning points for my relationship with God was, and it's a really long story, so I'll give you the shortened version of how crazy God works. But one of the early staff meetings I came back to, our church gathers every Tuesday, staff to meet. And this one Tuesday in August of 2018, I walked in and we had missionary partners there from Costa Rica. And they were there just to share an update about what God's doing in their lives. And when the wife spoke, she actually shared about her own sexual trauma. And it was just the craziest moment hearing her share what had happened to her 20 years prior. And I actually got the opportunity to meet with her after in Laura's office. And that she spoke so much truth into my life that day. And she's the reason I did end up reporting. And she's a huge reason Mend is here today. But what was crazy in that is it wasn't until a year after that initial meeting, we were wrapping up our first semester of Mend, and we found out she was going to be in town the same night as our final night of that semester. So she actually came and she spoke that night. And I remember sitting there and she actually shared that staff meeting day back in that August, a year prior, from her perspective. And what I didn't know was that she had no intention of sharing her story that day. In the middle of her talking about her ministry, she felt like God was telling her to share because there was somebody in the room that needed to hear that. And she's never shared that publicly before. And I just broke down crying that day because it really was that moment where I realized in that whole year that God was for me, and that he loved me that much that, and I always get super emotional when I talk about this, that he used her that day, even though he knew that there would be a whole year of me pushing him away, of just, it really felt like this wall that God was not allowed in that area of healing. he can have other parts of my life, but I didn't trust him with that. So although God knew there'd be a year of battling that, he still chose to use her that day and reveal a year later of just his goodness in that. And I will say one of the biggest things that helped really restore my relationship with God was having people like Laura and other friends in my life who prayed for me when I couldn't, because I just could not. And that brought a lot of shame too, of working on a church staff of, I was kind of hiding that piece that, here I am, that I'm supposed to be leading people in such a way, yet I couldn't have my own conversations with God. So, the assault definitely changed my view of God. But also God used that to really bring me back to a place with him today, which is not perfect. And there is still a lot to work on from that, from the assault in my relationship with God. But it's truly been so cool just to see him show up time and time again through it.
Yes. All of that. Yes. Oh my gosh. That's so good. Because one, I love that you're speaking on how we compartmentalize God sometimes. And I think so often we compartmentalize him to the good in our lives and the blessings, and we rejoice and we thank him at our dinner table and say the same prayer over and over again. But that isn't relationship often. Relationship with a husband or with a child or with a parent is the messy and the hard, and walking through that. And Laura, you had said before how Jena just really wanted to get to the end result. And I think that's such a habit of us as human beings. We just want to get to the joy, and we don't realize, or the healing, and we don't realize how much growth and pruning and sanctification is done in our time through the trial, that the character is being built and our patience is being strengthened. And the fight too, and just my encouragement to listeners, because I do the same thing, Jena, to not compartmentalize God and to fight to let him in to that healing, even when you feel like it's the last thing you want to do. And I do relate it back to like my marriage, that there are moments with my husband where the last thing I want to do is process through what just happened. If something really hard, really challenging, painful occurred, words were said, I don't want to go into that, because I know that there's going to be deeper cuts, because we're going to dig into the hard. And it's the same thing with the Lord. I think there's that fear, and the enemy allows for a foothold in that of distraction and filling our lives with other things. Because when we go into that, into the nitty gritty, messy, dirty, and we allow him into the compartment of pain and hurt, he digs pretty deep, and it sucks. Sometimes it's just painful, but the growth that comes is huge. And I also love that you mentioned having Laura and others who've advocated for you through prayer, because there really are those moments where you just don't have the strength or the ability or the want to pray for yourself, but to have prayer warriors around you who love you and who know you and advocate for you. That's I think prayer is often put off as a last resort. Okay, how can I help you heal? How can I love you? But prayer, the only one who can change your heart, the only one who can heal, the only one who can cause, a sense of redemption and healing is Jesus. So just touching on those, I really loved that you mentioned that. And Laura, I would just ask, do you have any other words for our listeners who are suffering with shame and guilt and maybe haven't spoken up? What words would you offer them today?
Yeah. Well, it's so hard because everyone's story is so different, but I would say you just tell somebody, because John 10:10, the enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy, but I have come so that you may have life and have it to the full. And you just think about that. The enemy is just having a playground with a lot of people, where he's just killing, stealing, destroying any sort of joy or any sort of community. And he wants you to keep this in a secret, dark space. Yeah. And just like you were saying earlier, when you bring it to light, it allows for healing. And so, our first semester of Mend, we had, probably 70 women in one room. And it was, people were visibly shaking as they were coming in because of the weight that they were carrying. Wow. But it literally, all of our leaders would say, like, you could see as we started talking and as the class went on, like, people's shoulders just kind of like going down, because they were just starting to settle in, and not the tension and the nerves were just like relaxing a little bit. And you're basically taking something that's you've held and and carried all by yourself for so long. And I know it's scary to lay that down, but oh, how freeing it is. Like, I've seen it time and time again. Like, it's one thing before Mend when all this was theory and we're like, we think this is a good idea. We think this is going to be helpful.
Yeah.
But we didn't really know because it wasn't tried. And then now, we've had these women go through it and we've heard their testimonies of the way that God has used this community and these speakers. And so just finding whatever that looks like, you might not have something like that in your area, but like, you probably have someone that cares about you. And so just potentially just have a conversation, and that you're going to have all the like butterflies and all that gross feeling. But like, once you let go of it, then you're allowing God to like move in ways that you can't even imagine.
Yeah. Amen. I was taking notes. Taking notes, because this is such a, like I said, such a big part of my ministry. And it's so, just freeing, like, to talk to women who get it and who have been there and who walk through it with others. So I just want to say thank you so much to both of you again for what you do in the ministry. It is not going unnoticed by the kingdom. Your treasures, your rewards are in heaven, because what a beautiful testament, for you, Jena, to share your heart, for you, Laura, to walk alongside, and for you both to come to bring that comfort to others. So beauty from ashes is what has come. That is Mend. So I would love for you to talk about, I know we've touched on it, but talk about what Mend is, how women can get involved, how others can get involved and support this ministry.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we both can touch on, but I think first is, Mend was just created to be the safe space for women who can come together with different versions of their sexual trauma stories, but at the end of the day, they know they're rooted in the same thing. They're hurting in similar ways, and they can relate on the same level on a lot of things. So we believe power in stories, and as we talked earlier, of just putting light onto such a hard and dark thing. So we encourage people to walk through the class. We always say it's one step in a long healing journey. It is not a fix-all, end-all, be-all, but we do believe that it really will allow for some healing and comfort to just walk through these hard things. We touch on topics like anxiety and depression and shame and guilt and vulnerability, forgiveness. We walk through all of it, of what the things, because that's what I learned through my story. And that's what we learned together walking through that book is, a lot of people don't realize that some of the hardest parts come after the actual assault, and it's feeling all these different things. So that is what Mend is. We want to walk through that with you. So I would say one way is to follow us and share about us to people in your life. We believe, statistically, you look at women, it's 1 in 4. So there's probably someone following you on social media or a friend that they can just kind of follow along if you share about it. And Laura can talk kind of deeper into just one of the hopes we've always had is to help equip other churches and other organizations to have something like Mend.
Yeah. So when we were looking at what we could offer, we're not looking to build something new. Like, I'm an editor of good ideas. Like, give me a good idea and I will modify it and edit it and we'll make it work.
Yeah.
But, right. Like, no need to start from scratch.
Yeah.
In this situation, it's probably one of the only ones where I felt like the Lord was literally dropping breadcrumbs and like we were just following what he was laying out because we did call other churches and we asked what they were doing. And a lot of churches group sexual trauma into other ministries of healing. And not that that's bad, and it can totally have its own, way of being used. But I think when you're able to focus on this topic specifically because of the way that, it's just unique, then we think that's beneficial. And so this is not our ministry. This is not Jena and Laura's Hope Community Church's ministry. This is the Lord's ministry, and we want to see it used however he wants it to be used. And so if there are people who are listening who might work at a church or a nonprofit or have some sort of heart for this, and they would like to know more, like, we are a free resource. We're not trying to make money. We're trying to help people. And so like we have, we're not perfect, right? We're only a year and a half into this. There's a lot of things that we're still learning, but, we're starting to record our speakers so that it can be used and shared. And we've got discussion questions already, like, laid out, and journal prompts and things like that. We have a training that, how we trained our leaders and how we could potentially train others. And so we would love to see this replicated at the more resources there are in various parts of the U.S., but even the world. We don't limit God on what he wants to do. And I'll also speak to the fact that we know this isn't just for women, because we know that this happens to men too. And our hearts break in the same way. But we just haven't gotten to that place yet. The Lord actually just allowed me, before I was on this call, I was talking to a man who was interested in potentially, he wants to be involved. He has this story. It happened to him when he was a child. And he is like, I know that this is real for them, men as well. And how can I help? And so we have no clue where the Lord is bringing this, but we want to equip and encourage as much as we can. And so if there's people who are interested, mend@gethope.net is our email. So you could email us. We'd love to just have conversations to see what it looks like. And it might look a little different based on, the people that you're serving, but we know something is better than nothing, because it's far too often not talked about.
Oh, so good. And where can our listeners find you on social media?
Yeah, it is mend_ministry. Okay. And we have that in both Instagram and Facebook. We update Instagram. We try to as regularly as possible. And what's cool is we will be offering Mend in the spring virtually as well. So COVID actually allowed us to explore that, which has been cool to allow people outside the area join in on a semester.
More beauty from ashes, right? I feel like we've all had to pivot in so many ways due to COVID, but I truly have seen people blossoming because they're really being challenged outside of their comfort zones and being challenged to do more. And I feel like it's allowing for us to reach more people virtually. So although the internet has plenty of its own downfalls, I am thankful for it sometimes. Yeah. Well, Jena and Laura, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your heart and your ministry. I would love to pray for both of you before we close out, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Father, we just thank you so much for this time. My heart feels heavy in the best way. I just love these women and what they're doing. And my heart goes out to women who are struggling and suffering with shame or guilt or just the secret of sexual trauma, Lord. I pray for those women specifically right now that you'll put your hand upon them, that you will give them the sense of freedom that they need to speak out and to speak up and to share their truth with someone else. Father, I pray that you will just remove the lies of guilt and remove the lie of judgment and all of those things that come with something so challenging and difficult. Father, you are the God of all promises, and your promises come to pass, and you promise to be near to those who are brokenhearted and crushed in spirit, Father. So I pray that you will be that today. I pray that you bless Laura and Jena in their ministry, that as they said, Father, this is yours. It's all yours. Everything that we do is yours, Lord. I pray that you will just guide them to continue doing this with excellence and put your hand upon it to grow it, to bless it in order to further heal hearts around the world. We love you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks,
right.
Lindsay.
Sure.
Yeah,
thank you both. All right, guys. We will talk to you all next Tuesday. Bye. For behind the scenes videos and photos, as well as info about our upcoming guests, follow along with us on Instagram at allthethings.podcast. You can keep up with Lenya at Lenya Heitzig and Lindsay at lindsay.maestas. If you'd like to listen to past episodes or learn more about us, visit the allthethingspodcast.com.